welcome to the Fall Forum, the 2021 version of the Fall Forum. This is something the Rangeland Center here at the University of Idaho does every year. But this year we've been joined by the McClure Center for Public Policy Research and the Idaho Rangeland Conservation Partnership. So today we're going to tell you a little bit about kind of how to dig in and understand where people are coming from in drought. We've been doing Rangeland Fall Forums for 6 or 8 years, and it was really an obvious solution or an obvious topic this year to talk about drought. Yesterday we had Ed Galindo and Kit Kimball talk to us, and they didn't talk specifically about drought, but they brought 2 points up that are really important. One is they both talked about the importance of education and learning. And the speaker today will talk about different views of things that they know about drought. And I think it's all about us building a common understanding of drought. So drought affects all of us differently, and building that common understanding is important. And another point that was brought up was that it's important for us to kind of start to trust each other and maybe empathize a bit. So one of the reasons that we brought some folks that have different perspectives on drought together for this webinar today is so we can maybe understand that it affects us all differently, but we all are affected, and we need to start to understand and trust each other on that. So we had some great plenary sessions yesterday, and now today we're going to dig into the details a little bit and talk about how drought affects us as individuals and in our jobs. And I'm just going to turn it right over to our moderator today, and that is Brenda Richards. Brenda is a rancher from Oahe, and she's also the coordinator of the Idaho Rangeland Conservation Partnership. So Brenda, thanks for bringing this together, and I welcome you, and I look forward to today's session.
Thank you so much, Karen, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Brenda Richards, and I am the coordinator for the Idaho Rangeland Conservation Partnership, and we are so excited for IRCP to be co-hosting this year's event. The Idaho Rangeland Conservation Partnership main event since we were established in 2018. That was in October of 2018, and we started right off with 2019 by holding our annual meeting. And our platform and what we are really focusing on is bringing diverse rangeland users and stakeholders together to talk about rangeland issues, not just from the ecological standpoint, but also from the social and economic perspectives, and look for opportunities, sometimes identify problems, issues, or barriers, find common ground, and leverage that understanding, and as Karen indicated, the trust to work forward for healthy economies, the health of the rangeland, and like I said, that three-legged stool, the ecological, social, and economic perspectives. Our meetings bring about the opportunity to cross-educate stakeholders on rangeland. Rangeland is so important to the West and so important to Idaho and our communities. And it allows a platform to share information, have open dialogue, and to promote understanding amongst the different users. And yesterday, as Karen indicated, we had 2 great speakers who brought their lifetime of experience and stories to help set the stage on how important platforms like this are to success for healthy rangelands, healthy economies, abundant wildlife, and thriving communities. And we look forward to promoting communication and finding the common ground, but as Karen also said, helping to understand the different perspectives people come from. Yesterday, Ed Galindo shared with us the importance of learning from each other. But that importance he emphasized means taking time to talk and share, but also with a focus on listening to each other and trying to create an understanding of the different perspectives. And that allows us an ability to find common ground for healthy rangelands, healthy economies, healthy uses in the multiple use, and to understand each other. Drought affects each of us in a different way and affects each of the areas, whether it's the social well-being, the economy, or the healthy landscapes and healthy wildlife. But the important point is drought affects all of us. And so today we're going to have some great discussion on that. We have an amazing panel that's going to share various perspectives on the drought aspect and talk about how we can understand these different perspectives, deal with drought, and maybe find some common ground and work with each other to be resilient in the effort to overcome some of these obstacles. We're going to start off with the rancher perspective on some of the challenges that ranchers face with drought situations, and continuing with that theme on how it affects ranch economics. And then we're going to move into some ecological considerations and wrap it up with some perspectives from wildlife. And with that, I'm so excited to introduce our first panelist, Jim Hagenbarth. I've had the pleasure of being around Jim, listening to different aspects from his rancher perspective, but also with his great knowledge and the help that he's done across the West with sage grouse working groups. Jim was born and raised in southwestern Montana, where he attended local schools. He received a business management degree from the University of Notre Dame, and Jim and his wife Lori now live in Dillon, Montana. Jim, along with his brother Dave and his son John, manage a livestock operation that began in Montana and Idaho in the 1880s. The Hagenbarths are dedicated to using livestock as a tool to cause the disturbance necessary to keep the grazing resource they manage healthy and sustainable over the years, because he believes that diversity and the sustainability of a working landscape and its communities are far more important than just an individual species. And he's a highly respected rancher who has been active in many conservation efforts, including the Big Hole Watershed Committee and, as I stated, many local working groups. So Jim, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brenda, and hi to everyone out there. Brenda, be sure to cut me off if I go over 12. I'm sure you will. We're part of nature, and a lot of people don't understand we're part of nature. And we have a huge obligation to manage the resource. And very few people get their head in the dirt and their ass in the air and figure out what the hell's going on. And but the public land rancher is huge, and they perform the responsibility that to society to manage the resource for society and also nature, but our real boss is nature. As you're doing this, I haven't made all the mistakes I need to make to know what I need to know to make everything work. So I'll be making mistakes for a while yet, and I'm be learning all my life. But what's really important is these ranchers in this setting will eat you up and spit you out if you don't keep your head up and use common sense and manage yourself first, then your family, and then what you're doing. So when you throw drought into this, it can be really devastating unless you have a plan. And you got to remember, drought is unpredictable. It's indiscriminate, and it's unapologetic. And it can happen anytime. You might have a good winter, but a bad spring or a bad summer. It can hit you anytime. So the way you handle that is you have to start by building a flexible management plan and grazing schemes that accommodate drought, because it's going to come sooner or later, and you better have a plan for it, or it'll be devastating. And so it's really, really important when drought pops its head up to make decisions early, so you don't get caught and get in trouble. And you got to manage your mentally, you got to manage yourself and your family above all things, because it can destroy you. So one of the problems we have in Indian Mountain West is we have a lot of intermingled ownerships in our grazing units, and that decreases the flexibility that we have, because we have to abide by agencies who have lands in our grazing units. So you really got to dialogue with those folks. And when they send you those letters, you start thinking about drought, and you be prepared. It's been just devastating in southwestern Montana because some of the folks hardly ever got to turn out. So obviously the key to drought is water. First of all, you have to have water, and it takes decades on your ranch to develop the water. You have in-stream water, you have springs, you have wells, you have pipelines, a lot of storage, stock ponds. But one thing that's pretty important, and it's kind of hard to do when you have sage grouse around, but quite often you have a spring that's going dry or it doesn't have very good flows. You can vegetatively manage, either use herbicides, prescribed fire, to manage the brush and conifers that are above those springs and really increase the flows. Just for an example, I have a spring that I've had to treat every 20 years. And when I treat that spring, I increase the flows from 1 gallon a minute to 15 gallons a minute. That's 11,000 gallons an acre, 20,000 acres, or 20 acre feet per section. That's unbelievable how much water is evapotranspired by brush and timber around these springs and water developments. So you can really help yourself. And what's really important when you're moving into fields, go to those fields a long time before you get there and make damn sure those wells are running and your springs are running. And so you can make adjustments before you get the cattle there. Another way that you can really help yourself, and this takes decades also, is to use vegetative management based on the soils and the precip to enhance the rangeland productions. And I've been using, dealing all my life with that and trying to get, I've been working with the Forage Range Resource Lab out of Logan. We have test plots, especially on our drier lands, and try to get species in there, especially if you've broken through a vegetative threshold that will handle drought better than the species that are there. When you start dealing with drought, you got to consider classes of cattle and the cattle performance and their gain and their pregnancy rate. And you use the cost accounting to figure that out. You examine your alternatives. For instance, a cow-calf, you can on a cow-calf outfit, you can wean them early. You can cull those older cows. You can cut your numbers, or you can sell your replacements. What's really, really important to understand is that if you manage, especially a cow, and don't give her the tools where she can do her job, and her number one job is to get bred every year, she doesn't fail. She fails because you haven't given her the tools. You're the one that's failed. If you're running a cow-calf yearling operation like we do, you have a lot more flexibility because you can deliver those yearlings quite a lot earlier. Of course, that costs you a lot of money because every day early that you deliver them costs you $2 a pound and $1.50 a pound or whatever you sell them at. So you got to understand the actions that you can take, but what are their economic impacts? If you happen to be leasing pasture in a drought, and you have to understand that the person that owns the pasture may ask you to leave before the grazing term is up. And just as if you're leasing pasture to someone else, it's the same. So anytime you're dealing in leases, you have to cover what's going to happen with that lease if a drought forces to leave sooner. When you're dealing with drought, you're looking at all the alternatives, and transportation costs go into that because you have to decide if you want to move those cows to another area that has more feed, you have to understand what those transportation costs are. Just as if you're going to move feed to your area, say if you're going to dry lot, you have to understand those costs, and you have to understand the costs of all the different feed alternatives. For instance, one year we had a really tough winter. Actually, the winter wasn't tough. but we didn't have a lot of hay because of the drought in the summer, and corn was cheap. So we ended up keeping the cows and feeding them 12 pounds of corn and 5 pounds of alfalfa, and they just did fine. But corn is really cheap. But you usually have to brainstorm and call people up. And my dad would call people up in the middle of the night, and they just knew it was Dave Hagenbarth wanting to know what you knew about something. So that's huge. When you have drought, you have to think about how you've marketed those animals before the drought started. And if you're involved in a forward contract, let's say on a video, you have to understand what that contract says about delivering those cattle early. If you're have risk management like futures, you have to understand that if you deliver those cattle early, your basis is going to be against you. And so you have to be pretty cautious and understand how those futures work, because generally the contract date and the time to deliver, the futures come together and the basis isn't as great. Okay, you have to also, in droughts, you have to explore your revenue opportunities. Sometimes, people have to move cattle. You're in a place where you may have a little more grass. You could either lease the grass to them, or you could buy their cattle. So you have to consider that. You have to also consider disaster funding. There's loans out there. There's feed that you can buy, and they can help you buy it. Also, there's FSA disaster payments that can help you out in a drought. And it's really, really important to dialogue with the FSA so you can understand how an entity structure and the internal pasture leases can impact the payments. When you start to do estate planning, you do a lot of different things and get different entities, and you have to have all those leases straightened around, or you could miss out on some of those payments based upon FSA guidelines. There's, of course, drought insurance. And there's something new that has just come around called Pasture, Range, and Forage Index. I don't know a lot about it, but you kind of bet on the lack of rainfall. And if you're right, you're paid off. You get paid a little, and if you're wrong, it costs you money. But that's something new. So those are some of the experiences that we've had in drought. It's part of our plan. A lot of our ranges are 4 to 8 inches of moisture, especially in Montana where we winter. The last 2 years, we've lost 18,000 acres of range ground, actually last year, and we'll lose it again this year. But we plan ahead. That's how it is. That's what that range is all about. But it's a hell of a lot better than buying hay, and it's the best hay field in the state of Montana when you can graze those cows out there. So that's a little I know about drought. If you have questions, that's where you really find out more. So thanks for the opportunity to address you, and hopefully my mistakes has helped you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. We really appreciate that. I really love the way that you talked about the fact that it's not just planning for on the ground or with your cattle, but it's a mental plan too. I think that's really important when you're talking about that, the financial and having the alternatives out there. But one thing I found really interesting was you mentioned your vegetation management to increase soil moisture. And I'm wondering if maybe we don't have any questions in right now, but I would like to maybe have you expand just a little bit in your couple minutes on that. If you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, there's 2 different places we do that. In Idaho, we're dealing with a plant called Wyethia and also sagebrush. And on Wyethia, we've increased our production 300% by using herbicides. And on sagebrush, we've increased it also, and also helped in keeping the sagebrush diversity in regards to cereal stages. In Montana, it's quite a lot more interesting. Because we're so dry, you have a lot of matted grama grass. We found out that you can spray that with a herbicide, Roundup, about the 16th of June. Then you can plant it with Siberian wheat grasses, Babeloff 2, and some western wheat grasses, and costs about $67 an acre. You'd have to have some subsidy to help you do that, but it's unbelievable what you get. This year we've had 1 inch of rain since April, and the folks that come up and looked at that, Kevin Jensen, and by golly, it's unbelievable what those grasses can do, and what you can do if you understand the soils and understand the precip you have and understand the plant material out there that can do it. What's really, really important though, is you can do it without disturbing the soil. You use the no-till drill and you keep the blue grama sod in place so it holds the soil. And I think that's something that we all have to look at and really increase the production on your ground, not only for your use, but for the use of the wildlife.
That's great, Jim. I think that was something that is really very interesting, and a couple of tools and a couple of ideas there. We did have another question come in, and that question was, do you supplement protein during late fall dormant season grazing? And if you do, does it change for drought?
When we're using, I would much rather use natural protein, and we're playing around with Forage kosher, which has the ability to give you 14-15% protein. I really don't, if we can stay away from, and quite often you can't, supplemental proteins with a lot of sugar and molasses and stuff, it gets those little bugs in those cows' bellies going so fast that those cows' appetites get a lot bigger and they eat a lot more. When you're wintering out in the winter, you want those cows to settle down. If you can use natural protein, Forage kosher or regular kosher or whatever, or winter fat, you can do a lot better job. But if you haven't got it, then you have to use those supplements. If it's doing anything other than drinking water, eating and laying down, it costs you money.
Okay, Jim, thank you so much. We do have about 3 more questions that we'll take at the end, because we're gonna, like I said, have some more opportunity at the end, but we appreciate your sharing your information, and we're gonna move on to the next speaker, and we'll get these questions for you at the end here. So thank you, Jim.
You're welcome.
Our next speaker is keeping in the same concept of talking about ranching, with ranch economics. And John Ritten is a professor of agriculture and applied economics at the University of Wyoming. He also serves as the state's agricultural systems extension specialist. He received his bachelor's science in marketing from the Arizona State University, an MBA from New Mexico State University, and has a PhD in natural resource economics from Colorado State University. He was originally stationed at the James C. Hageman Sustainable Ag Research and Extension Center in Lingle, Wyoming, and recently served as the interim director for the Wyoming Agricultural Experiment Station. His research interests include the intersection of ag production and natural resource management. And ranching economics and rangeland sustainability have been the focus of many of his research and outreach projects, and I've had the pleasure of reading several of your papers and listening to you speak before, so we're excited to have you. And
again, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're at. I think there's probably a mix based on who's attending. So basically, Jim answered all the hard parts for me. Just listen to him. I think you got drought figured out. I'm going to talk about a little bit more probably forward looking. I think that's what Karen wanted me to do. So I'm going to start with some work I've done in the Central Plains and then kind of work back into Wyoming a little bit. I think it's probably easier to look at someone else's problems rather than have to look at your own. So that's kind of the strategy I think we're going to take. And I'm going to talk about variability here. So livestock production, ranching would be easy if there wasn't any variability in prices or production or policy or anything else. The problem is everything's variable, and that can wreak havoc on ranch economics. So as we go through this brief talk, I want you to keep in mind 4 points, right? And again, if you have never seen me talk, I try to tend to have a good time, have a little bit of fun. If I stop having fun, I'm going to stop coming to work. Rangelands are important, right? I think that's probably goes without saying to this crowd. But again, they're important for a couple of reasons. One is just the land cover globally as well as in the Western United States, right? They're a large portion of the land base, and they provide a lot of benefits to society, right? So I think a lot of people tend to overlook rangelands. Again, living in Wyoming, people think about Yellowstone, and we think about, you know, the Tetons, right? The mountains, but rangelands is what makes us work, and it's so much of what we do. A lot of work I've done is that it's been proven to be cheaper and easier to maintain what we have, right? So maintenance of ecosystem services or conservation of working lands is often a much cheaper and easier as far as time and monetary and labor resources than it is to try to restore or reclaim lands that we have lost to conversion. But I also see that rangelands are under a constant threat, right? Whether it's subdivisions going up, whether, again, we get where I live now, right? I'm guilty of it. I have 20 acres of 25 years ago, used to be about a 5,000 acre working sheep ranch, right? So we have these ranchettes out there. Jim talked about water development. That's something that concerns me in the future is as water becomes more scarce, and in the West, we're having higher demands on water. What's going to happen to those water rights? Are we going to lose working lands just for the water rights? And then what happens to the landscapes that depend on that water? So one thing you hear me preach about a lot is we need to be proactive, right? We need to try to find ways to keep, in my mind, working lands working so that we continue to derive these benefits from rangelands that are so important to our society. So again, with that in mind, I want to talk about a few things about climate variability specifically. And I work a lot, the primary producers in Wyoming are cow-calf producers, and we do have some that are cow-calf yearlings as well, as Jim said he is. But most of our working ranches have breeding stock, and destocking and restocking cycles can just be devastating for a ranch. The one that we don't always think about enough is just the biological time lag. Again, if you go to any extension webpage, we have enterprise budgets, right? And it's always an annual production cycle, which makes sense for cropping systems, right? We can respond to increase in corn or soy prices by planting more of those crops next year, or whatever. There's usually some plant back restrictions for herbicides, but it's usually an annual decision. For a working ranch, if I have to destock, specifically breeding stock, and I send some cows to town, it's really a triple whammy to me. One is I'm selling cows at a time when prices are probably depressed, as long as the drought is wider than just my ranch, right? We're going to have a surplus of cows at the market, which could have tax liabilities depending on your accounting system. That might be a capital gains issue you're going to have to deal with. Another issue is that we're now going to have less calves for sale next year, right? Because I've sent my production facility to town. I've sold a capital asset before the end of its useful life. I may not recover the investment I made in her. So I might take a hit there. The next year, as we have less of our production facilities out on the ground working for us, we're going to have a smaller calf crop. Now, when I decide to rebuild, right, I'm rebuilding from a smaller calf crop to begin with. My revenues are negatively impacted. And most of the operators I work with prefer to retain from within. So we keep back replacement heifers. So now if I want to rebuild my herd, I start with a smaller number of calves that I can send to town. And I'm going to hold even more of those back. So I've taken a double whammy as far as revenues this year. And then we've got to put all the money in to develop, right? There's lots of different ways to do that, depending on optimal body weight you want to reach. But it costs money to turn a heifer calf into a bred heifer, right? And then even with that, we're optimistic to say we get 80% of our heifers bred. And so some of the ones we keep back, we send to market later on at kind of that yearling stage, which isn't really what the market wants. We're probably going to take a hit on those. And then the next year when those first calf heifers do give us a calf, not all of them are going to breed back in time to be retained. So now we're selling 2-year-old heifers, which again is probably going to take a discount at the market, depending on your marketing strategy. So we're 2, but probably 3 years from when we decide to start to restock until we get back to where we want to be. So it's a minimum of a 3-year production period as I see it for livestock production. So that's one whammy of climate variability, trying to match forward supply and forward demand. And then the impacts of wet and dry years are not equal. So again, I'm not an English major. I'm a numbers guy for a reason, but dry is more bad than what is good, is the way I say that, right? So the additional surplus of having an extra inch or two of rain is not the same as having an inch or two less of rain hits us negatively. And so anytime we're talking about increasing that variability over time, the negative impacts far outweigh the positive benefits. And this is an example of a forage production response for Southeast Wyoming, just outside of Cheyenne. And you can see the last 50 millimeters of rain on here going from 350 to 400 don't give us a whole lot of extra grass, but going from 50 to 100 give us a lot. So as we move left back down that forage response, every deficit in terms of precipitation really hits our grass, right? Our forage supply is impacted. If we get a little bit of extra rain, that's great, but it doesn't do a whole lot for us. And again, from that livestock production system, when we look at what this looks like over 40 years, this is forage production in 40 years, again, at that same site, kind of northwest of Cheyenne. And I'm going to throw on a line here that shows average over the 40 years. So the first thing I learned working in this system in Wyoming is there is no such thing as average. Yeah, we got 3 years that are maybe kind of close here. But if you're planning for average, you're not planning very well. So imagine now that you took over a ranch and you're coming in at the beginning of this area I've highlighted. You come in on a year that's slightly over average. Great, things are looking good. And I have this talk with my students all the time in our ranch management classes. The second year, you have a pretty big drought and you're down 25, 30% of your forage. What are you going to do? Right? You can try to bring in some feed if you want, or you can try to decrease forage demand. And if you destock, then the next year, what happens? We have surplus. And there's nothing quite as bad as leaving grass out there to some people, right? We've wasted that grass. So we try to rebuild. And then we have a below average year and then 2 more below average years. And now we're in a real conundrum. But if you notice, this 10-year period isn't unique just to that 10 years. This is normal in Wyoming. And so if all the dry years came together and then we had a period of wet years all together, it'd be far easier to manage. But trying to match forage supply and forage demand with this interannual variability is really problematic. And then some colleagues of mine looked at for the Central Plains, what does the future hold as far as variability in precipitation? They went in and included CO2 impacts and temperature, and what does it mean for forage production? So we took this same model and said, okay, what happens if the wet years get wetter and the dry years get drier, but on average, we're the same. And so historically in this region, we would expect 1 out of every 6 years that we're not going to make any money. So we have to make enough money every 5 years to cover the down year. If all we do is make the wet years wetter and the dry years drier, but on average we're the same over a 40-year period, if we increase that variability by 50%, that becomes 1 in 3. That can be not great for livestock production. This is what causes that is that orange line going from the top left to the bottom right is your cow numbers, not just during the droughts. Remember, we have more wet years too. Over that 40-year horizon, we're down 40% of our cow herd. And this ranch we modeled was 200 head of cows. And in that part of Wyoming, you can't afford to ranch full time on 200 cows, so you've got off ranch income. It also implies that we need upwards of 20% more off ranch income to subsidize the ranch during the dry years, even though we get wetter wet years. So what does the future actually look like again for the plains? It's east of you guys. Don't worry. I'm sure that looks rosy in Idaho. But mid-centuries, that's basically, 2050, and late centuries is 2100. This is forage production. We're going to have more surplus years, slightly more deficit years in the northern plains. And by the end of the century, we're going to have a lot of surplus years and about the same deficit years. Central plains is going to be more of both, increased variability, southern plains even more so. The one thing this doesn't talk about is quality. And as Jim pointed out, right, that's an issue. So we actually expect forage quality to go down a little bit. So in the northern plains, even though at the end of the century, we expect more surplus years and about the same drought years in terms of quantity, we expect those yearlings to actually gain about 30 pounds less over a 5-month grazing season. And then we're also going to see wood encroachment coming in from the east. So we have kind of that double whammy there as well. So I'm just about out of time. I'm going to cut to the chase. What can we do? Again, Jim said it well, flexibility. You need to start thinking about how we get around all these obstacles that are coming up. We know about some. There are some that are coming we need to just be prepared for. Diversify, right? Diversity in all things. Jim alluded to one of the options we've pushed is adding stalkers to a cow-calf operation. We've done this work here in farther east of me and down in New Mexico. Anywhere from 60 to 80% of your AUM should be tied up in your cows, and the rest should be flex in terms of yearlings that you bring in when you have it and don't when it's dry. I think multi-species grazing might become important as we start to see more encroachment of other species. One thing I will point out, though, according to the Ag census is the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen cattle producers become less diversified. And that means that there's more people relying only on cattle. So we've done the opposite of what we should do, I think. Diversification in land and geography is important. Now, a lot of us in the West have this, right? We have our mountain pastures in the summer, we come down to our hay meadows in the fall and winter. But we're starting to see these big storms come through and be much more swathier, where areas get rain and other parts don't. So the larger operations that have multiple landholdings in multiple states are more likely to at least hit the lottery in one of those locations to get grass. And again, as Jim alluded to, if you can send your cows somewhere else, bring feed in. There's lots of reasons why that doesn't work. I think we need to start to address those now. And again, income sources. Do you have an Airbnb you can put on your place? Do you have hunting leases, fishing leases? What can you do? Can you embrace new technology to figure out where soil moisture is? Get some moisture probes out there on a wireless network so you know where your cows are and where the grass is going to be next week. And all of these have time, scale, and framing issues associated with them. Again, animal production and loan payments typically happen on an annual or couple every year basis, whereas any sort of soil erosion, plant community thresholds happen decadal. Make sure you're keeping track of both of those time horizons. And this is a regional and national issue, but nothing's going to work unless it's a local solution. So it's got to be viable both ecologically, economically, socially, and politically in that area. So start trying to figure out how we can address this for the next 20 to 50 years, because it's going to start to change, I think, as far as timing and intensity of droughts. And we need to go, Jim talked about, we have a lot of response out there, disaster response. I think we need to go more to climate preparedness mindset. I grew up in South Dakota. I knew what a tornado siren was, and I knew to go down in the basement and get in the bathroom even if my parents weren't home. When I moved to Laramie, I didn't have that discussion with my kids. Well, in the last 3 years, we've had 2 tornadoes in Laramie. Now we've had that discussion. It wasn't something we had to be worried about before, but now it's becoming clear that tornadoes will happen in Laramie. It's no longer an if, it's a when. And that's what's going to happen to increase variability for rangelands across the Western United States. So let's start thinking about it. And I'm probably over time, and I apologize, Karen and Brenda. This is my contact information. If anyone has questions, to send it to me directly if we don't have time for them now. Thanks again for having me, everybody.
So John, thank you so much, and really appreciate your perspective. So again, I'm going to move on to our next speaker. So thank you, John. So our next speaker, I'm really excited to welcome Hailey Wilmer. Hailey just moved to Idaho. And maybe I have this. Yeah, Jason, I've got you at the end. So anyway, we're going to go with Hailey, and we're really excited. Hailey, when we asked her about being on this panel, we're just so appreciative of the enthusiasm and the response right away, and so glad to have her here in Idaho, and would like to welcome you, and everyone give her a big welcome, and we all look forward to working with you. So Hailey is the Research Rangeland Management Specialist at the USDA ARS Sheep Experiment Station in Dubois, Idaho. And her research there focuses on sustainable rangeland management practices in the range sheep systems of the Intermountain West. She uses a social and ecological system lens to develop and evaluate the outcomes of manager decision-making for food production, biodiversity conservation, and rural well-being overall. Dr. Wilmer also works to advance management science partnerships through participatory, collaborative, adaptive management and rancher-centered research methods. So we're really excited about that. She completed her master's and PhD in rangeland ecosystem sciences at Colorado State University. So with that, Hailey, we look forward to hearing what you have to say, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Brenda. And it's always tough but fun to follow John Ritten. So I'm glad that he was here. It certainly influenced the way I think about drought. And I'm just really excited to be in Idaho at the sheep station. I think it's been about a decade since we've had a range scientist here. So I got here in June, and certainly it's a good year to come to start thinking about drought in these systems. And it was really fun to hear Jim's perspective today too. I'll start out actually with a poem. A few years ago, a professor at Colorado State did a fun project where range scientists could hire The funding went to a fundraiser, poets to write about their range science. And Leslie Roche, who's a researcher in California who had done a lot of work on how ranchers were adapting to drought there, had this poem written about her work by Retta Brugger. And Retta, the poet, is an extension specialist in Colorado. The poem is called Coping. Coping. Distance from dust to disaster is small when reliant on rain that doesn't come, grass withers and teats dry. Dryness overwhelms operations, options dwindle, outfits fail. Seeds wait, the bank does not. But understanding grows gradually. Hazards destroy, a hopeful residue abides. The truth? Threat triggers memory. Next time, safe like seeds, we persist. I thought that did a nice job of capturing some of the ecological and social dynamics that drought really brings out. And that's kind of what I'll be focusing on. I have kind of 4 ideas for you all to think about, and they come from my experience working in adaptive management literature, predominantly in the Great Plains. So I'm pretty excited to be in the Intermountain West, but also just hundreds of hours of riding around in pickup trucks with producers and asking them how they see and deal with drought. That Retta and I put together in a range management drought school in Colorado that she actually just got some hard funding for. So she's actually going to have funding to help producers write drought plans in Colorado based on this framework that we put together. So I want to give her credit for these ideas. She was really a huge part of the conversation. These ideas are, I think, a little bit more general than some of the specific strategies and tactics that the other speakers have talked about, but they kind of help me organize the management question of drought, which is really as much about a mindset as it is about having the right strategies or the right resources. When Retta and I go into a community and we've been asked to give a drought management school from the local extension folks, we often ask people to think about the last drought that they remember. Do they remember one in the last 5 or 10 years? How about 20 or 30 years or even longer? And in some of the communities we've gone into, folks remember droughts from the 60s. We asked them to think about how they knew it was coming. How did they make decisions? Did the operation have a plan, or did it catch them by surprise? And what were the outcomes of that drought? Were there social consequences, financial consequences, or ecological outcomes? Did the operation bounce back, or did it get set back? So think about that question and what your experience of drought is as I talk briefly about these 4 ideas. We hear a lot about having a plan, but the timeline for that plan and the plan for what also matters. And so the first idea I want to introduce is that this is just like personal family health or herd health, that having a plan has multiple stages. So if you're a young person and you're going to go out and talk to ranchers or farmers even about drought or climate, and we're in a drought emergency room, it's not an appropriate time to say, make a plan. It's too late for that. So having a plan is really something to do on the good years or in the wintertime. Think about what resources you have available to you, and then think about the relationships you have, whether that's with the FSA office. Jim mentioned that. If you don't have an existing relationship with them, it's hard to walk in during a drought and get the resources you need. Think about who you can call to ask for advice, and then think about how you're storing that water or that forage, assuming that drought is a normal part of rangeland management. So that's like the preventative care. That's like diet and exercise, taking your vitamins, going in for checkups, having that plan early on. And then as you go into a more high risk situation, as drought is approaching, you can start to mobilize that plan and make sure that you have trigger dates. When are you going to make that decision you don't want to have to make? How are you going to know it's time to make it? Who are you going to talk to? And then once we're finally in a drought, that's when that emergency plan kicks in. That's when you can go down and chat with FSA, chat with the folks, you already have your insurance in place, you already have your plan in place, and it's a little bit less of an emergency room situation. Just to avoid that question of, am I going to sell cheap cows or buy expensive hay? That's a situation you don't want to be in. The second idea, just to reiterate what John said, is working with variability. Variability in all kinds of rangeland management. It's really important to think about. I wish I had a cooler word to use of variability, but Justin Durner and David Augustine, who are two ARS scientists, came up with this neat little framework that they published in Rangelands in 2016 that I really like. It focused on using variability in drought, and they said, try to predict it, watch the forecasts. I know folks don't put a lot of trust in the forecast, especially in parts of the world where the forecasts don't have a lot of skill, but it can help you avoid a risk, a wreck. Track it, flex stocking rates with weather and forage availability and variability. Think about different ways to add diversification or to drop those stocking rates down without culling your base genetic herd. But anticipate variability with conservative stocking rates. And then finally, use inherent variability or create it where you can across the landscape, across topographic gradients, or across broader distances to get out of that drought or to use variability to your advantage. So I always say, think like a pastoralist, not like a farmer when you're dealing with these large, extensive systems. And that's something ranchers have told me over and over again. Okay, the third idea I want to introduce, in addition to working with variability and thinking about kind of a long-term plan to avoid the emergency room, is the idea of moving or reducing risk. And this framework comes from folks that work in extensive systems all over the world. I want to credit AgriWall 2006, which is actually where this comes from, but other folks have looked at it in Mongolia, in the Great Plains, in different parts of the world, to think about ways to reduce risk. And the first way is to move risk over space. So can you access grazing lands in different topographic or geographical areas that might help you reduce risk? Move risk in time, or this is the idea of storage. So a stockpile of hay, water, grass banking, again, those things take a lot of time, but storage reduces risk over time. And that can be a community scale conversation, not just at the ranch scale, because a lot of times, it might take a rural economy in a community to really pull that off for folks in the area. The third way to reduce risk is to reduce risk across asset class or to diversify. John talked about this too. So other forms of income that are potentially less tied to the rainfall and forage, or just different types of livestock or different classes of livestock that help you reduce the risk. And then I really like this one. The fourth one is to spread risk across the household or to share or pool. They call it community pooling in the development literature. But this is the idea of a branding or getting friends together to help share equipment or labor so that you're thinking about these problems and you're doing the work together. I think it could be pretty easy, especially in times of when we're all online more, to get more and more isolated. But it's really important to reach out and share those opportunities with folks in the younger generation and share that resource across household. And then the last one is to use market-based approaches. So insurance has been mentioned, or even just, opening up to a broader network exchange across broader distances. So those ideas work really well if you have your existing relationships and contacts in place. And we emphasize that a lot in the range schools. Make sure that you've got those people on speed dial. It might not be your immediate neighbors. Maybe they know a little bit too much about what's going on the other side of the fence. So it might be someone a little bit further away that you've built contact and trust with, that you can chat with when things come up. And certainly down at the local USDA office, it's really important to have those contacts in place with your range cons from NRCS, Forest Service, BLM. Okay, and then the last idea that I want to share just really quickly is this idea of shifting baselines. And what that really means is, I think first we always have to recognize the just huge amount of intergenerational knowledge on rangelands that our multi-generational ranchers and our range cons. When I get a chance to talk to someone who's been in the Forest Service for 30 years, I'm just always amazed at how much they know about the landscape, the impacts of drought, and how to kind of mitigate those risks. And that local knowledge is really one of our unsung resources to deal with drought. But at the same time, and John mentioned this, we know conditions in the atmosphere, climate and weather, and social conditions and economic conditions are changing really rapidly. So the types of challenges we're going to be facing during a drought or any extreme weather event, honestly, because a blizzard can be just as traumatic, they're different than our grandparents had to face. And it's important for us to think about those shifting baselines. And certain in the rangeland grazing literature, we're seeing plant communities respond differently to grazing than they did 20 or a century ago. So these relationships are dynamic, nothing is static. And so baselines are shifting, and the possibilities for how we deal with these kinds of challenges is going to continue to shift. Okay, I'll read the poem one more time. I hope you can hear it again, maybe in a little bit different way, and think about kind of these ideas of shifting baselines, moving risk or reducing risk, working with variability, and then thinking about a health analogy for planning to avoid the emergency room. Coping by Retta Brugger. Distance from dust to disaster is small when relying on rain that doesn't come. Grass withers and teats dry. Dryness overwhelms operations, options dwindle, outfits fail. Seeds wait, the bank does not. But understanding grows gradually, hazards destroy. A hopeful residue abides. The truth? Threat triggers memory. Next time, safe like seeds, we persist.
Thank you so much, Hailey. No, you were focusing on your presentation, but we had several comments. Thank you. I really love your perspective. And when we get to the end here, I wrote a couple things down that I want to bring back to your conversation. So appreciate you being here in Idaho. Appreciate everything you just shared with us. Our speaker to wrap up the panel this afternoon is just a great dynamic person who brings a lot of passion and a lot of this understanding and willingness to work with the diverse stakeholders together. And so it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Jason. He is one of our steering committee members for the Idaho Rangeland Conservation Partnership, and it's one of about 45 hats that he wears. But I will say, the great thing that I appreciate about Jason is no matter what he's doing, he brings an honesty, an understanding, and a passion to it, and is a can-do type of person. Jason grew up in the Lost River Valley of Central Idaho, and attending the University of Idaho, received a bachelor's degree of science in fisheries management and a master's degree in public administration. Currently working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Jason is responsible for coordinating the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, as well as sagebrush conservation activities throughout Idaho. In his free time, he is an avid hunter, a fisherman, and an Alaskan ranch owner. Working and recreating throughout Idaho and the West has instilled in him a passion. Ensuring the sustainability of and advocating for the conservation of working landscapes for wildlife, as well as the communities of people who depend on them, is what Jason's all about. So with that, Jason, we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good afternoon. So I'll get started here and hopefully we'll avoid any technical difficulties. The presentation I want to talk about today and have been asked to try to provide a perspective on is that of wildlife primarily. And the primary topics I want to talk about is that, you know, the lens upon which we look at drought really matters based on our perspective. And we really need to start to incorporate thresholds into this. And some of these conversations have already started to occur. But the first perspective I want to help share is that of a quick story. And 2 years ago, this is an aerial view of out of the plain of my ranch in Alaska, where we receive approximately 60 to 70 inches of rain annually, with approximately 6,000 pounds of forage production per acre on our lower lying areas. And the pilot called me in August in frantic as he was flying over the ranch before I'd gone out there and said, you know, Pyron, you need to get to Alaska now. You know, we're in the middle of a drought. It hasn't rained for 13 days. your cattle are thirsting to death. And I got this voicemail because I was preoccupied in other meetings and just started laughing. And it reminded me, of just how different all of our perspectives are in where we grow up and where we're from. And by no means were our cattle, quote unquote, thirsting to death, or did they have any issue whatsoever. But he was legitimately concerned, and the people within that community that operated within other industries certainly had a lot of reason to be concerned. And so when we talk about drought and we look at how we define drought, the point of perspective I want to make is that we need to try to always remember the three lenses of ecological, social, and economic. And we're all, trying to work together through these times. And as an important lesson we learned yesterday, empathy and compassion are critically important. And we need to ensure that we are looking through these lenses as we try to identify solutions and ensure that they are sustainable or approachable solutions through these various lenses. So as we look at the ecological perspectives of drought, which is primarily what I'll talk about today, I think it's important to remember that is incredibly diverse. And if you're looking through the eyes of a little baby sage grouse that is walking across the vast sagebrush sea landscape, your perspective of a drought is much different than that of a migratory duck or salmon who is migrating in across continents or between oceans and fresh water. And as we start to look at the various impacts of drought and the solutions that we are trying to identify to that, we need to try to ensure that we're looking through the various ecological lenses of the components that we're trying to work with on the landscape. And people are one of those. Across the sagebrush steppe rangelands, we certainly have a lot of various plant and animal species. And within those plant and animal species, there's incredible variability on life history stage that they're within, as well as the different types of populations or life history strategies that they may represent within that species. And that's when I want to get back and continue to emphasize, I think, what all the other speakers have emphasized, and that's the need for local solutions to national and global problems. We need to look through a very specific and local lens at trying to identify these, because the species, include two-legged and four-legged, have very individual type opportunities and life history strategies to adapt to these places depending on the place that they're at. And so we all have to have water. And the reality being is that we need to look at how we have water through various lenses as well. And Jim was extremely insightful in this, in that we have above ground water resources, we have below ground water resources, we have within soil water resources, and we have within plant water resources that are subject to evapotranspiration. And so, I think it's really easy for us to get focused on some of the more simplified versions of drought and what may occur in above ground precipitation over a course of a specified amount of time. But that's, we need to take a little bit more of a broader and holistic perspective. And as we do that, I think it's important for us to realize the complexity of the life history strategies of some of the species that are occurring. And the reality being is that, in no different than a cattle operation, or anything else, your health and your productivity from the previous year may affect your health and productivity going into the next year. And so vital rates and migratory behaviors and your relative fecundity is all impacted based on various species over different amounts of time and through different seasonalities. And so the stochasticity of these ecosystems for, these Western rangelands that we're working within is incredible. And, we oftentimes get these very important storms that occur in very localized areas but are relatively small to the overall landscape, both for maybe a sage grouse population or a local community or an individual rancher. So the concept of looking at ecological minimums and thresholds is not new. And we need to start to look at this in a lot more in-depth capacity as we start to look at drought. And I think that we need to start monitoring these in a much more intentional way, I guess, for lack of a better term right now, and be very purposeful about that. And when we talk about, these perspectives, of these thresholds, we need to understand that they're going to be changing, and based on very localized conditions within the plant communities that we manage. And the plant communities overall are largely what all the various species of wildlife and people depend upon. So, I want to make sure that while we continue to work on all this, meanwhile, we're in a world of hurt. Drought is impacting this from an incredible diversity of directions in ways that it's impacting fuel loading and fire behavior, as well as post-fire responses in plant communities. And so I want to try to shift some of the conversation towards the fact that we do have ways that we can be more adaptive and we can be more successful. And some of the new science that we have out there, I think, really points to how carefully we need to look at our perspective of drought. And if you recall back several slides ago, I have these national depictions of drought, which is what we often see. It covers half a state or a third of the West as an extreme or drought, And the reality being is that drought can occur on very small scales and be very individualized within the landscape, and can be greater or can be more or less impactful in crossing these various thresholds at much smaller scales than what we're currently monitoring. And when we look at this, it's absolutely fascinating to me to look at some of this research that was shared with me recently by Matt Germino, and that, a 7-day deficit in the month of March makes or breaks seedling success. And ranchers recognize that it's the timing of precipitation more than the amount of precipitation that, and they've constantly continued to tell us that. And we've known it in brood production that spring rains, forward production, et cetera, is incredibly important. But we're starting to get into these very minute thresholds that we aren't paying attention to at all at the scales in which, we need to. But we're starting to gain the science and the tools. And so when I look at maps like this, you can't look at a drought map that's covering these types of scales and expect us to predict success, in post-fire or in restoration types environments that are very, very, very minute and are impacted incredibly sensitively within some of these variables. But, on the better end of things is we are starting to get new science. We have better soil moisture data. I do believe that we can start to get across these thresholds, and we may be able to start looking at meaningful scales of drought and meaningful thresholds of drought that matter to some of these post-fire restoration as well as pre-fire invasive annual grass type restoration treatments. And so we start to talk about in the big picture, what is success? And we can't expect change in outcome without the change in our process. And, you know, we've been using these big picture tools. We keep getting large mega fires. We keep using antiquated equipment from the 60s and 70s. We do a coin flip with a bunch of money thrown at it, and we may or may not get success, and we may or may not get invasive annual grasses. The process that we've been using at the scales that we need to make an impact should not, in my opinion at least, be defined as success in the future of where we're going. We have to have new expectations. We have to invest in science. And the biggest thing that we have to do is we have to find out ways to institutionalize the use of the science and the processes by which we move forward. And so how do we start to incorporate this new science and these new tools into our everyday and annual period of performance or programs of work? And that is absolutely key, I think, if we are going to overcome these very large landscape issues and the issues of persistent drought. And so as we look at new definitions of success, you know, in my opinion, we absolutely have to make new investments in infrastructure. What is resilience in rangeland ecosystems? What is large-scale investments in infrastructure relative to climate change look like right now for Western rangelands? I guarantee you that if the agricultural and farming communities went into their annual operating cycles with the antiquated tools that we're currently using from the 60s and 70s in rangeland restoration, they'd all fail. They are using soil water temperature probes or located in every pasture and every field that they have, you know, daily monitoring what their annual water use is out of the individual pivots. They've got drone technology that is looking for little spots in the field where they may have a clogged sprinkler head or various issues, GPS technology and GIS technology for absolutely very precise and accurate management of the landscape, which they're trying to make money off of. And so I'm trying to challenge folks to imagine future scenarios and smart investments that we can make to increase the sustainability of our rangelands and try to overcome the issues that we have. And I want to challenge people with what are smart investments, and the fact that, you know, is it unreasonable to expect us to monitor at much more local scales, at meaningful scales relative to rainstorms and precipitation patterns that across the West, relative to paying for mega fires and suppression efforts that are occurring? And I want to ask that we start to do the economic assessments to look at what smart investments are. And I'm not advocating that I have the answers, but I do have a strong hunch that we could probably invest in plant communities more on the front end, and probably would pay dividends on the back end if we were to take a more proactive approach. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Brenda.
Jason, thank you so much. I think, you know, with the focus on you work so much on the wildlife, but on the rangeland conservation aspect, and I think that was a perfect way to tie it all together, because we all depend on the rangelands for different reasons, and healthy rangelands is what it's all about. I really want to, before we get into the questions a little bit, I want to just reiterate that the opening session yesterday was to kind of bring some of that experience and stories into why we need locally driven, why we need to, as Kit said, bring people into the tent and have these communications. And I think one thing that hit me very, very much listening to all four of our panelists is to talk about communities, about that support, about building the trust, and looking outside maybe your safe zone for some of the solutions that are out there. And I think then both Ed and Kit hit on it yesterday too, and Jason, you just hammered it, is the locally driven aspect. Every one of you today talked about knowing your local aspects, knowing the resilience that they're planning for that. And I think, Jason, you just hit on that. I'm really excited for that science, because we all know what the drought maps look like. We also know that in little corners of our neck of the woods that sometimes things are going, a lot better, and we do have those little seedlings that are surviving. So with that, Jason, I do have a question for you. You were talking about very small habitat improvements, and so can you share with us some of the things you might envision the difference?
I'm sorry, Brenda, you cut out a little bit. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, what sort of, air quotes, very small habitat improvements do you envision?
Well, I thought Jim brought up an excellent one, and that was like treatment of springs, proactive, vegetation management to manage all the different cycles of water, from evapotranspiration, very small, beaver reintroductions is an incredible component to these upland and riparian health, to store water in these little banks in the headwaters, the various types of vegetation that we are planting to ensure that we have resilient systems to wildfire that, encourage and include deep-rooted perennial grasses.
Oh, that sounds great. And sometimes it's just those little things that make a huge difference across the landscape. So thank you. But Hailey, Jason just hit on a good thing, and everybody talked about this. Jim opened up, with some of this conversation. But Hailey, you were talking about water storage, and that water storage is kind of a key to resilience. But it's also a planning tool, and you talked about it in the form of community. So maybe if you just take a little few seconds here to tell us what your thoughts are on how you envision that.
Sure, I think that's one of those situations where in our qualitative work where we've gone out and asked ranchers from a research perspective, what are you doing to cope with drought? This came out of some focus groups that some folks at the University of Arizona and I did, where the water storage, whether it's on public land or private land, can be a really great example of how communities work together to get around red tape and financing constraints. It can be pretty challenging to put in new water developments on federal land, and it can take the whole NEPA process. And so that really is starting 5 years ahead, working with folks at the Forest Service or BLM, getting those relationships together. But there might also be conservation organizations that see a benefit to wildlife for putting something in. And so they might be able to help with that process or help with the funding or cost share. And so there were some examples that we heard in our research from folks in Utah and Nevada that were building broader collaborations across state, private, and public lands to build better infrastructure for water. And, that, talk about long-term, I mean, that really does take some dedication, but it's the sort of thing where if you get it through and you can stick with folks, it can really pay off, especially in these dry years. So that's an example. Was that kind of what you're getting at?
Yes, Hailey, that's exactly what I was getting at, and appreciate that. I think that's part of the importance of these platforms and these, having this communication is drought affects all of us. Drought affects, those that are dependent on the rangeland, those that use the rangeland, those that just appreciate it, but it also stretches out, like you just said, to our communities. And, with my rancher hat on, it affects prices, it affects, productivity, it reaches out. And I think this cross education and this communication of understanding all the different perspectives And the opportunities for some resilience and some planning ahead on all levels helps with the empathy, the understanding, and also the trust and bonding in community. John, I don't know if maybe you have something you might want to add kind of along that aspect. I know when you talk about economics and stocking and restocking, you know, in the livestock industry, you're spot on. That has a 3-year impact. So, you know, wet versus dry. I like that dry is more bad than rain. So maybe you can talk about that from a community level, and also if you want to add anything on the water aspect.
Sure. So we've actually had some discussions with some of my colleagues when we're working on drought, especially across the Central Plains, is how do we actually start to take advantage of these geographic differences? Hailey talked about it. Jason talked about it. Jim a little bit. But, you know, Jim talked about more, you know, transportation costs of getting my cows to where the grass is. But there's also a very big trust issue of how far am I going to send my cows, and who's going to make sure my cows stay alive and have water and catch whatever disease, what have you happens. So if I'm talking about trying to partner, you know, in my producers here in Wyoming with, say, Eastern South Dakota and maybe Oklahoma to make sure that we get some rain whenever it does fall, there are a lot of trust and community level aspects that have to play into that. And what happens if we all are dry at the same time, right? How does the system stay together? So that's where I think it's going to take, as Hailey points out, a lot of work, a lot of community building to try to find those solutions. And again, that was just something that we spitballed as a way to make it work, but then there's all the reasons it doesn't. And likewise, even on public lands management, and Jim alluded to this, right? If we have commingled cattle up there and one of the people in the allotment wants to change their calving date and they want to move it earlier, then that's going to create havoc. So we need to have open, honest, and frequent communication with the people that we're working with. And water development, you know, in theory, again, should help all of us survive good times and bad times, but who gets access and when and how are the costs and benefits shared? To go back to Jim's example of the lease, right? I mean, I don't know how many friendships I've seen ruined because we had a handshake lease over pasture rent, and it's gonna fall apart eventually, right? So let's get down and talk about the things we don't want to talk about and make sure that we plan ahead. And we're all understanding each other's where we're coming from, what we need to get out of this relationship, and how we're going to make it work when things go wrong. Because it's pretty easy to make it work when things go right. But and Hailey talked about this too. You don't make a drought plan during a drought. I get asked to come give talks about how to develop a drought plan during every drought, and I say, yeah, we should have been doing this 3 years ago, guys. Right? So now's the time to do it. It's not easy, but you need to stick to it, and we need to find ways to really build that trust in a very, you know, independent kind of business, right? We're all our own bosses and we're in this for a reason, but we need to find ways to really be collaborative and make collective decisions that are going to benefit us all, or else we're in for some tough times, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that, John. And I think Jim hit that head on, that you can't start planning for a drought, you know, when you're in a drought. You've always got to, we always talk about having plan A and having plan AA because we've already gone to Z. So real quick, we've got a couple more minutes. I've got a question for Jason, and then I'm going to shoot one to you, Jim. But Jason, you work across, you know, many of us have worked with you across we like to talk it across land ownership boundaries. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about what John just hit, is that when you're looking at a drought situation, you know, and especially from a wildlife perspective, we talk about that in all our meetings. Wildlife don't know if they're on state, private, or public. So, you know, maybe you can talk about that importance there from your perspective across land ownership boundaries.
Yeah, I think that in essence, the key word that I think that we all need to keep in mind on this is flexibility. And the reality being is that the more resilient our systems are and the more flexible our management options are, then the better our outcomes will be in the end. But part of getting back to what John just said is that flexibility requires a lot of trust, typically operating from private landowners onto public resources. And unfortunately, we don't have as much trust as we really need to between the land management agencies and the operators to provide the flexibility that these individuals need to manage the ground and the economic and social perspectives. And unfortunately, I don't know, I don't have a great way to improve that over time, but I do think that in my opinion, the way that we're addressing it and the way that I'm taking personal responsibility for it is to co-locate staff in communities rather than within centralized, large institutional brick buildings and city centers. We put our staff and take advantage of the pandemic and the virtual world that we have, but these individual agency people live in these communities, they work with these landowners, and they build the trust and the knowledge of the local resource to competently and trustfully manage it in a flexible way.
Thank you, Jason. I think that you just put everything into perspective there. Unfortunately, I would love this conversation to go on all afternoon, and I think we do have some more potential for continuing this conversation. I'm going to kick it back over to Karen. Again, I think we could have this conversation go on all afternoon, but I so appreciate each of you, your perspectives, your knowledge, and your willingness to share, and appreciate your time on the panel today. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Brenda Mash. This was really a great panel. I really admire all of these speakers, and I'm so happy that you guys all took our invitation and came. I'm kind of amazed at how the discussion about local solutions and trusting and understanding keep coming back. And although there's a lot of technology and a lot of science that's really great, it seems like it really comes back to just that local one operation at a time sort of solution. So I believe you guys really brought that to the plate. And thanks so much to everybody. Have a great afternoon. Hope to see you tomorrow.